When I first met Elias Greyhawk, I was only 19 and the world still smelled like rain and river soil after a long summer storm. I remember that day as clearly as if it were pressed between the pages of my life, never to fade. I was standing by the old bridge in Willow Creek, my skirts rolled up, my feet dipped in the cool water, humming a tune my mother used to sing. And then I heard him, his voice, low, gentle, full of laughter that carried across the wind. "Careful, miss," he said. "The river doesn't forgive the ones who stare at their own reflection too long." I laughed, not because of his words, but because he said them like he knew what it meant to lose yourself in what could never be yours. Elias was a traveler, a builder's son who came to our village to help his father fix the church roof. But to me, he was more than that. He was everything the world had told me I couldn't have: freedom, music, and the kind of love that made you believe you could run barefoot across heaven without falling. We'd meet by that same river each evening when the sun dipped low and the birds grew quiet, and he'd tell me stories of places far beyond the hills, places I had only dreamed of. He promised one evening, as fireflies circled us like tiny lanterns, that he'd come back for me. "You'll see, Ada," he whispered, his fingers brushing mine. "When the house is ready, I'll come for you. I'll make you my wife." It's been 62 years since that night, 62 years, and I can still feel the warmth of his hand on mine. Funny how love, when it's real, leaves fingerprints that even time can't erase. He left 2 days later, the morning fog still clinging to the fields, his wagon creaking down the dusty road. He turned once at the bend and I waved my handkerchief. He smiled, that soft, quiet smile, and called out, "I'll come back for you, Ada." And then he was gone. I stood there until the sun climbed high and the mist burned away, until there was nothing left but silence and the ache of waiting. For years I waited. I wrote letters that were never answered, kept candles burning on the windowsill, prayed to a God I wasn't sure still listened. Every sound of wagon wheels on the dirt road made my heart leap. Every stranger passing through made me hold my breath. But the seasons turned, and life, ruthless, relentless life, kept moving even when I wanted it to stop. By the time I turned 30, people had stopped asking about Elias. My mother passed away, my father's hands grew weak from work, and the house grew quieter each year. I learned to live with the waiting as if it were a second skin. Some nights I'd stand by that same river and whisper into the dark, "You promised, Elias, you promised." Then one morning, decades later, when my hair had already turned silver and my back no longer straightened easily, I heard a knock on my door. I wasn't expecting anyone. The world had long forgotten me, or so I thought. But when I opened it, the light from the porch fell across a young man's face. Sharp jaw, brown eyes, and that same crooked smile I had once memorized in another lifetime. He stood there, hat in hand, looking nervous and uncertain. "Ma'am," he said softly, "my name is Nathan Greyhawk." Elias Greyhawk was my father. For a moment I couldn't breathe. The world went still. The ticking clock, the whisper of wind outside, even the hum of my old kettle, it all disappeared. I gripped the edge of the door just to stay upright. Your father?" I whispered. My heart pounded like it hadn't in years. "Elias?" "Yes, ma'am." His eyes were kind, and when he spoke I heard echoes of Elias in every word. He passed away 3 months ago. He told me to find you." I wanted to speak, to ask why now, after so many years, but my throat tightened. I could barely stand the sound of his name being spoken in past tense. Dead. The word echoed through me like thunder. I motioned for him to come inside. my hands trembling as I set out tea. He looked around at my small kitchen, at the faded photographs on the wall, and I saw recognition flicker across his face. He used to describe this place, Nathan said quietly. Said it was the only place that ever felt like home. My eyes burned, but I didn't cry. I had run out of tears decades ago. He said that, I asked, my voice breaking. Nathan nodded. He carried your picture in his coat pocket until the day he died. Said you were the one he should have never left. I felt something twist inside me, pain and peace tangled together. All those years I had cursed him for forgetting me, for breaking his promise. And now here was his son, standing in my kitchen, carrying the weight of a promise that never reached me. We sat in silence for a while, the kettle hissing softly on the stove. I couldn't stop staring at him, the way his eyes mirrored Elias's, the way he carried himself with that same quiet confidence. It was like the past had walked right into my home, wearing a younger face. Finally, I asked the question that had been living in my chest for 60 years. Why didn't he come back? Nathan looked down at his hands, twisting his hat. He tried, ma'am. He really did. But there was an accident. The year he was supposed to return. He was badly injured and couldn't travel. By the time he recovered, he thought you'd moved on. Said he couldn't bear to face the life he'd stolen from you with his silence. I closed my eyes and felt tears slide down my cheeks, silent, unstoppable. The years of wondering, of half-hating and half-hoping all came crashing down at once. So he did remember, I whispered. Yes, Nathan said, his voice trembling. He talked about you until his last breath. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, weathered envelope. My name was written on it in a hand I knew better than my own. My fingers shook as I held it. After all this time, Elias had written to me. I didn't open it right away. Instead, I just stared at it, the paper soft and yellowed, like it had aged alongside me. And I wondered, was I ready to hear his words now when he was gone and I was old? Would it heal me or break me all over again? Before I tell you what I did next, let me ask you something. Would you open that letter if it were you? After decades of silence, after loving someone who never came back, would you want to know the truth or keep the memory untouched? I sat there for a long while after Nathan handed me that envelope, staring at my name written in Elias's hand. It was faint. The ink faded and smudged near the edges, but I'd have known that writing anywhere. My name, Ada, written with care, like he was afraid the world might forget me if he didn't carve it down right. The envelope trembled in my hands as though the paper itself still remembered his touch. The weight of it felt heavier than it should have been, not because of the paper inside, but because it carried 60 years of silence, unanswered prayers, and the ghosts of every what if I'd ever whispered into the wind. Nathan sat across from me, silent, respectful. His eyes followed every move I made. I could see the tension in his jaw, the same way Elias used to look when he was about to confess something he didn't want to say. I traced my finger along the flap, feeling the glue that had sealed my youth shut. Then slowly, carefully, I opened it. The paper inside crackled softly like autumn leaves underfoot. My eyes blurred before I even began to read, and I had to blink hard to steady them. My dearest Ada, it began, and just seeing those words made my heart stop. I hadn't been called that, not with love, in over half a century. If this letter ever finds you, it means I failed to keep my promise. I swallowed hard. My hand trembled. Nathan looked down, giving me privacy as I continued. He wrote about the day he left, how he'd gone home to help his ailing father, how life had cornered him faster than he could run. There'd been an accident on the docks where he worked. He'd fallen, broken his back. The doctors said I might never walk again, he wrote, and for a while I believed them. I wanted to come back to you, Ada, but what kind of man returns broken when he promised you the world? I stopped reading. My lips trembled as the words sank in. For years I had cursed him, called him a coward, told myself he'd forgotten me. But no, he hadn't. He'd suffered alone, too proud to let me see him weak. The next lines were harder. I heard later that your mother had passed, and I thought perhaps you had moved away. I came once, years later, to the edge of town. I saw your home light through the trees, but I couldn't knock. You looked so peaceful sitting by the window, and I didn't want to bring back pain. I walked away that night, Ada, but I never stopped loving you. I pressed the paper to my chest. My body shook with sobs that came from somewhere deep, from the part of me that had waited by that river every night for years, whispering his name into the fog. Nathan's voice broke the silence. He carried that letter everywhere. He said maybe someday someone would deliver it for him, and before he passed, he made me promise to find you. I looked at him then, really looked, and saw the same eyes, the same kindness. It was as if time had played a cruel trick, letting me see Elias's love through another man's face. You have his eyes, I whispered, and that same way of holding guilt like it's a second heart. Nathan smiled faintly, his gaze dropping to his hands. He said you were the best thing that ever happened to him. He regretted everything. I didn't know what to say. My mouth opened, but the words caught in my throat. There's something strange about closure when it comes too late. It doesn't heal you. It just rearranges the scars into something quieter. I folded the letter and placed it back in its envelope, then slid it across the table toward Nathan. You keep it, I said softly. He looked shocked. But it's yours. I shook my head. No, it's yours now. That letter was written to the girl I used to be. I'm not her anymore. But maybe through you, his words can live where I no longer can. Nathan's eyes glistened. He pressed the letter against his chest, and for a long time, neither of us spoke. The house was silent except for the clock ticking on the wall, the same one that had marked the seconds of every lonely night I spent waiting for a man who never came. After a while, I poured him more tea. The air between us felt heavier, yet strangely peaceful, like two souls who had finally met after wandering too long in the dark. He told me stories of his father, how he'd built a small carpentry shop, how he used to hum the same tune I once sang by the river, how he'd never married again. He said no one could ever match the way you looked at him that summer, Nathan said, his voice trembling. He told me that love like that happens only once if you're lucky. I turned my gaze toward the window. Outside, the sun had begun to set, and the sky was painted with the same golden hue it had been the day Elias left. My hands clenched the fabric of my dress as I whispered, "He wasn't wrong." The silence between us grew gentle. Nathan seemed unsure whether to stay or go. I could tell he carried more than his father's message. He carried his own guilt, perhaps wondering if coming here had hurt me more than healed me. So I reached across the table and placed my wrinkled hand on his. "Thank you," I said, "for bringing him back to me in your own way." His hand tightened slightly around mine. "He wanted you to know that love doesn't end, even when life does." I nodded, my throat thick. "I know," I whispered, but sometimes knowing doesn't make it hurt any less. He left just as the first stars began to appear. I stood at the door and watched him walk down the same path his father had taken so many years ago. When he reached the bend, he turned, and for a moment I saw Elias again, that same half smile, the same glint of sunlight in his eyes, and I waved. When I closed the door behind me, I pressed my back against it and let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding for 60 years. The room felt both emptier and fuller, empty because he was truly gone, but full because, for the first time, I knew the truth. Later that night, I sat by the fire and opened my old journal, the one filled with all the letters I'd written but never sent. I took out a fresh page, dipped my pen in ink, and began to write one last entry. Elias, I wrote, you kept your promise after all. You came back, not in the way I imagined, but through the Son who carries your soul, and that's enough. My hand shook as I wrote, but I smiled through my tears. For the first time in decades, I felt peace. Not joy, not even happiness, just peace. The kind that comes when you've finally stopped fighting the past and started forgiving it. Would you do the same if you were me? After all those years of silence and heartbreak, could you forgive someone who broke your heart simply because they once loved you enough to try? It had been 3 months since Nathan's visit. The days had slipped by quietly, one into another, like falling leaves that made no sound when they touched the ground. But I felt different now, not lighter, not happier, just settled. Every morning I brewed my tea and sat by the same window where I used to wait for Elias, the light spilling across the wooden floor like memory itself. Sometimes I caught myself humming that old tune he used to whistle when we walked by the river. My hands would move without thought, folding laundry, watering the geraniums. But my mind would drift back to that letter, to his voice between the faded lines. You'd think 60 years would harden a heart. That time would turn longing into stone. But love doesn't vanish with age. It simply quiets. It becomes a kind of hum beneath the skin, something you don't always hear, but you always feel. That afternoon, the wind carried a softness I hadn't felt in a while. I was out tending to my garden, the small patch behind my house where the marigolds bloomed bright as fire, when I heard footsteps on the gravel path. I turned, shading my eyes, and there he was again, Nathan. He stood at the gate, holding something small and wrapped in cloth. His smile was unsure, the kind that belonged to someone afraid to intrude, but too compelled to stay away. "May I come in?" he asked. "Of course," I said, my voice trembling just slightly. "You know this garden's always been open to your family." He smiled then, the same soft, lopsided smile his father had when he used to bring me wildflowers from the meadow. We sat on the bench beneath the old maple, the one that leaned just enough to cast dappled shade. Nathan placed the wrapped cloth on his lap. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The air smelled of earth and rain, and something else too, something familiar. "I went through my father's things," Nathan began slowly. "I found something I think belongs to you." He unwrapped the cloth carefully, and my breath caught when I saw what lay inside. A small wooden box carved with tiny etchings of vines and rivers. I recognized it instantly. Elias had carved it the summer before he left, said he wanted to give it to me when the timing was right. I thought he'd taken it with him, but here it was, decades later, in the hands of his son. My fingers brushed the lid. The wood was worn smooth like it had been held many times. I opened it slowly, afraid of what memories might spill out. Inside were little things, a dried flower, a photograph, a silver hairpin, and a folded note yellowed with age. My heart clenched. The flower was from that last summer, a daisy I'd tucked behind his ear as a joke. The hairpin was mine. I'd lost it by the river the day we said goodbye. And the photograph, oh, that photograph, it was us. Someone had taken it at the county fair. Elias had his arm around me, and I was laughing, head thrown back, eyes closed. We looked so alive, so certain that life would wait for us. Nathan sat quietly, watching my reaction. He kept those things with him, he said, all his life. That box never left his bedside. I pressed my palm over my mouth, fighting the tremor in my chest. He remembered everything. Nathan nodded. He said the world took his strength, but not his memories. He used to tell me that love isn't a season. It's the soil. Even when the flowers die, the earth remembers where they grew. I closed the box gently and looked at him. Your father had a poet's heart. Maybe that's why mine never healed after him. He smiled faintly, eyes glistening. He'd be glad you kept yours open all these years. We sat there for a long while. The wind whispered through the maple leaves, and I could almost hear Elias's laugh among them. Then Nathan said softly, "There's something else." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small envelope. He wrote another letter, one he never sent. I think he meant for you to have it after I brought you the first one. My hand shook as I took it. The paper was newer, less faded, but still in that familiar scrawl. I unfolded it carefully. Dear Ada, it began, if my son is reading this to you, it means my time has finally run out. I don't know if I ever earned your forgiveness, but I hope you found peace somewhere between the pain and the waiting. I used to dream about the life we never had. A little house, a garden, maybe a child or two running through the grass. But dreams are cruel that way. They grow even when you stop watering them. I want you to know something. I never forgot you. Every sunrise reminded me of your hair in the morning light. Every rainstorm sounded like your laughter, and every time I saw my son smile, I thought of what we might have been. If love is meant to live again, maybe it will, through him or through you, or maybe just in the quiet moments where the past still breathes. With love that never ended, Elias. I couldn't finish reading aloud. My voice broke halfway through, and Nathan reached across the table, his hand finding mine like it was always meant to be there. For a while, neither of us spoke. The letter lay between us, a bridge between two lifetimes. After a long silence, Nathan whispered, I think he wanted to make sure you knew you were his only one. Tears rolled freely down my cheeks, soft and silent. I know that now, I said, and that's enough. We buried the letter under the maple tree together that evening. The soil was cool and damp, and I whispered a quiet prayer as we covered it with earth. Rest easy now, Elias, I said. You finally came home. Nathan stood beside me, his eyes wet but smiling. He'd be happy knowing you found peace. I looked up at the darkening sky. Peace isn't found, I murmured. It's chosen. I think I'm finally ready to choose it. As the first stars blinked awake, Nathan turned to leave, but I stopped him at the gate. Nathan, I said softly, promise me something. He turned back, curious. When you have children, I said, tell them this, that love can outlive time, and that sometimes even broken promises find their way home. He smiled, nodded, and walked into the fading light. When he disappeared beyond the trees, I turned back toward my house. The porch light flickered to life, casting a warm glow across the garden. I sat down in my chair, the same one I'd once waited in, and for the first time in my long, long life, I didn't feel like waiting anymore. That night I dreamed of Elias, not young, not perfect, but whole. We stood by the river again, the water glimmering gold, and he took my hand, whispering, "I told you I'd come back." And when I woke, I wasn't crying. I was smiling, because somehow, through his son, through the years, he truly had. I hadn't been back to the river in nearly 40 years. Not since the day Elias left for good. Life has a way of closing places in your heart the way people shut doors, quietly and for reasons that only make sense much later. But after Nathan's visit, after the box and the letter and the soil that held my tears, I felt something stirring in me again, something that whispered, "Go back." It was early autumn when I finally listened. The air carried that crisp ache that only comes before winter, when the world feels halfway between living and remembering. I put on my old shawl, the one I'd knitted the year Elias left, its edges frayed but still warm, and I made the slow walk down the familiar path. Each step stirred the past, the crunch of gravel, the scent of pine, the faint hum of water in the distance. It all came rushing back like an old song that had never truly stopped playing. When I reached the bend where the trees parted, I stopped. There it was. The river, still moving, still breathing, still carrying the same shimmering light across its surface. Time had changed everything but that sound, that low, endless murmur of water against stone, the same sound that once carried our laughter, our secrets, and the promise he never kept. I stood there for a long while, my cane pressed into the earth, watching the current. Then I saw it, the flat stone where we used to sit. It was half covered in moss now, but I'd know its shape anywhere. I lowered myself onto it slowly, my knees protesting, my hands trembling. But when I sat down, it felt right, like a circle finally closing. I opened the little box Nathan had given me, the one Elias carved all those years ago. Inside, I'd placed the photograph again, along with a few petals from my garden. I traced the edges of his smile in that photo and let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. "I'm here, Elias," I whispered, my voice cracking against the wind. "You told me you'd come back, and in your way, you did." The river didn't answer, but somehow I felt it listening. I thought of all the years I'd lived waiting, waiting for his letter, for his apology, for some sign that the love I gave wasn't wasted. I'd wasted my youth on the idea that closure would come in a grand moment, in a return, in an explanation. But closure, I realize now, isn't something you receive. It's something you give yourself when the heart decides it's time. A small bird landed on the branch above me, singing softly. Just a few notes, delicate and unsure. I smiled. "You must be tired of hearing my old stories, too," I said quietly. Then I did something I never thought I'd be able to. I took the photograph, held it over the river, and let it go. The wind caught it gently, spinning it once before the water took it, carrying our faces away, fading into the reflection of the sky. I whispered, "Go on, love. Let the river keep what I no longer can." And for the first time in my life, I didn't reach for what was leaving. The tears came then, soft but unrelenting. Decades of silence breaking free in the rhythm of the river. But they weren't tears of bitterness. They were something else, lighter, like rain after a long drought. After a while, I felt a strange warmth beside me, like someone had sat down though the stone remained empty. My breath caught. I closed my eyes. And in that hush between wind and water, I could almost hear him. His laugh, low and rough. His voice, the one that used to call my name like it meant something sacred. "I told you I'd come back, Ada," it said, faint, almost imagined. You just had to open the door. I smiled through the tears. You found your way, even through the years. The wind picked up then, swirling the leaves around me. I watched them dance, gold, red, brown, spinning in a wild, fleeting storm before they drifted to rest on the water. It felt like a goodbye, the kind that doesn't break you, but heals you. When I finally stood, my legs wobbled but held. I looked out at the water one last time and said softly, "Thank you for loving me, even in your absence. And thank you for coming back, even if only through memory." I pressed my hand to my chest and smiled, feeling the echo of his heartbeat against my own. As I made my way back up the path, I realized something strange. The ache that had lived in me for so long was still there, but it had changed. It no longer felt like a wound. It felt like a scar, the kind that doesn't hurt anymore, but reminds you that you survived. The sun began to set as I reached the edge of my garden. The sky burned orange and pink, and for a moment I imagined Elias standing by the fence again, smiling that boyish smile, waiting for me like he used to. But I didn't walk faster this time. I didn't reach out. I simply smiled back. Inside my house, everything was just as I'd left it, quiet, gentle, and still full of him. I set the empty box on my shelf beside the framed photograph of my younger self, the one taken at the fair. For the first time, I didn't look at her with pity. I looked at her with pride, because she had loved deeply, maybe too deeply, but she had survived it. That night, I made myself a cup of tea and sat by the window as the stars began to bloom across the sky. I thought of all the people who hold on to ghosts, who wait for letters that never come, who live between hope and grief. And I wanted to tell them, it's okay to let go. You don't lose what you release. You carry it differently, lighter, quieter, more beautifully. I reached for my old notebook, the one where I used to write poems I never showed anyone, and scribbled a few lines. He came back not through promise, but through the son who bore his name. Love, it seems, never dies. It just learns to whisper instead of sing. I closed the notebook gently and smiled. That was the ending I had waited for all my life. Not a reunion, not a confession, but peace. As the clock ticked softly in the corner, I whispered into the still air, "Rest now, Elias. I'm finally home too." That night I dreamed of the river again, only this time it wasn't rushing or roaring the way it used to. It was calm, still, glimmering beneath the moon like a long mirror. And in it I saw reflections, not of the woman I am now, but of the girl I once was, the one who believed love could wait forever. She looked at me, that young Ada, her hair wild and her eyes bright with hope. She didn't speak, but she smiled, a soft, forgiving smile that said, "You made it. You carried me all this way." When I woke, there was light spilling into my room. Morning had come, quiet and golden. I sat up slowly, my bones stiff, my heart oddly light. It had been years since I'd felt that kind of peace, the kind that doesn't demand anything from you, that just lets you breathe. I made myself tea, chamomile with honey, and took it to the porch. The air smelled like rain and lilac. The world was awake, the birds chattering, the wind stirring the curtains, the soil still damp from last night's storm. I sat in my rocking chair, wrapped in my shawl, and just listened. For so long I'd filled my life with noise, memories, regrets, what ifs. But now the silence didn't frighten me. It felt sacred. It felt earned. Across the yard, I saw Nathan's car pull up. He got out, carrying a small basket. Muffins, by the looks of it. He waved that same warm, genuine smile his father once had. "Morning, Grandma," he called out. I smiled. "You're up early, sweetheart." "I thought you might like breakfast company." He came up the steps and sat beside me, handing me a muffin still warm from the oven. "Blueberry, your favorite." I took a bite, and for a moment I tasted summer again, those long, endless days by the river when everything was simpler, when I still believed love was something that could stay. "Do you ever think about him?" Nathan asked after a while. His voice was careful, like he didn't want to break the peace that hung between us. "All the time," I said softly, "but not the way I used to. I used to think of what could have been. Now I just think of what was, and that's enough." He nodded. "He'd be proud of you, you know, for keeping his memory alive." I smiled faintly. "I think he'd be proud of you, Nathan. You gave me something I didn't think I'd ever have again." "What's that?" "Closure, a bridge between then and now." He looked down, his eyes misty, then said, "It's funny, isn't it? Sometimes we're sent to finish what others left undone." "Yes," I said. "Love has its ways of returning. Sometimes not in the same face, but in the same spirit." We sat in silence for a while after that. The wind moved through the garden, and the world just existed. I felt my heart swell, not from pain this time, but from gratitude for the years, the lessons, the love that came and went and somehow still stayed. I thought back to the river, to the moment I let the photograph go. That single act had changed everything. I'd always thought closure meant hearing an apology, finding an answer, getting the truth. But sometimes closure is just giving yourself permission to stop asking. I turned to Nathan and said, "You know, when you get to my age, you realize the past isn't something to run from. It's something you learn to sit beside." He smiled, understanding. "You're wiser than most people I know." I laughed softly. "Wisdom's just what's left when the tears run out." He chuckled at that, then looked out at the horizon. "You ever think you'll fall in love again?" His question surprised me. For a moment, I just stared at the line of light breaking over the trees. "Love," I said, almost whispering. "I think love never really leaves us. It just changes shape. These days I find it in small things. A sunrise, a kind word, a visit from you. I don't need grand gestures anymore, just moments that feel true." He reached over and held my hand. "Then I hope you have 1,000 more of those." I squeezed his hand gently. "Me too, darling, me too." When he left later that morning, I stayed on the porch long after his car disappeared down the road. The world was quiet again, but I didn't feel alone. I felt surrounded by every memory that had made me, by every loss that had taught me how to love deeper, softer, better. The wind carried a faint scent of river water, and I closed my eyes. For a heartbeat, I could almost hear Elias laughing again, could almost see him turning back just once more before the distance took him. But this time I didn't reach out. I just smiled. I whispered into the air, "Rest easy, my love. You found your peace, and so have I." Inside, I sat at my little wooden desk, the same one that's seen me through countless letters never sent and stories I never thought I'd tell. I opened my notebook to a fresh page and began to write, not for him this time, but for myself, and for anyone who's ever held on too long. I wrote, "We wait for the ones who left, not because we think they'll return, but because we hope they'll remember us kindly when they don't." I let the words settle there, plain and quiet, before closing the book. As the sun dipped low and the house filled with the golden hush of evening, I thought of everyone out there, every soul still waiting for their letter, their apology, their closure. And I wanted to tell them something simple, something true. Sometimes you don't need the ending you dreamed of. You just need the courage to write your own. Because forgiveness isn't for the ones who left, it's for the ones who stayed. And I stayed. I lived, I loved, even when it hurt. That, I think, is what makes us whole again. I looked toward the old photograph on my shelf, the one of me at 20, laughing beside the river, and whispered, "You did your best, Ada, and that's enough." Outside, the stars began to bloom one by one, quiet witnesses to the end of a story that had waited half a century to be told. And so, with a heart lighter than it had been in years, I smiled into the night and said softly, "This is beloved Grandma, reminding you that sometimes love doesn't need to come back to be real. Sometimes it just needs to be remembered. If my story found a place in your heart tonight, don't just leave it here with me. Share it. Maybe someone out there is still waiting for a knock on their own door. This is beloved Grandma, where memories breathe again, and love, even when broken, still remembers your name."